Have you heard about this perfect storm that's supposedly brewing in the global economy? Well, today we're diving into sources that claim this storm isn't just a threat to the US dollar, it's actually hitting the gas on its decline as the world's go-to currency. So let's unpack what's going on here.
Okay, let's start with a number. A huge one. $38 trillion. Just let that sit there for a second. What on earth could a figure that massive even represent?
Yep, that's the U.S. national debt. And according to the sources we're looking at, it's a huge piece of a toxic mix that's creating a challenge to the dollar's dominance unlike anything we have ever seen before.
Now, the argument laid out in these sources is that it's not just about the debt, as big as that is. It's about three totally distinct crises hitting all at the same time, and they're converging to create this single massive challenge to the whole global financial system.
So, the first part of this storm, it's political. We're talking about a crisis of trust that, our sources argue, is striking right at the heart of the entire financial world.
Right, so this is where it gets really interesting. According to the Standard, a criminal probe into the head of the Fed isn't just some internal U.S. issue. No, it's seen as injecting this incredibly volatile element of political risk into the one institution the world counts on to be boringly stable and independent. It's a huge deal.
Okay, so let's move on to the second shock and see how this all stacks up. On top of all that political drama, you've got the simple, crushing weight of the U.S. fiscal deficit.
To really wrap your head around that $38 trillion number, the sources break it down like this. It comes out to about $112,000 of debt for every single American. And the interest payments? The country is paying over $2.5 billion in interest every single day.
And that brings us to the third and final piece of this perfect storm, the military angle. We're talking about a massive proposed hike in defense spending that just adds even more pressure to a system that's already looking pretty fragile.
The figure being proposed is $1.5 trillion for the defense budget. Now, the sources really emphasize that this number doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's a gigantic new spending promise being made at a time of absolutely historic national debt.
So, what happens when you mix political instability at the Fed, just staggering levels of debt, and a huge military budget? Well, this storm isn't just happening over the US. It's causing some very real reactions all around the globe.
And you can see the pressure was already building. The sources point out that even before these three shocks really hit hard, the dollar was already projected to weaken by 9% in 2025. This is all part of a much bigger trend of countries looking for alternatives. You might have heard it called de-dollarization.
This slide really gets to what one source calls a ridiculous paradox. You've got the US needing other countries to buy its debt to fund its budget, right? But then a chunk of that budget goes toward military operations that could run completely against the interests of the very nations that are lending the money. You can see how that creates some serious tension.
And this chart shows you the result of that tension in real time. Major creditors are basically voting with their money. China, for example, has been slashing its holdings of U.S. treasuries from its all-time peak, and it's now at a 17-year low of just under $689 billion.
Okay, so we've got these political, economic, and military shocks all leading to this global reaction. But how do we tie it all together? Well, one source puts forward a pretty unique framework for thinking about this whole moment. They call it the imperial snap.
The first big idea in this framework is something called a topological hole. Now, just think of it like this. Trust is the fabric holding the financial system together. An event like an investigation into the Fed chair is like a sudden, deep rip in that fabric. It creates a hole, a void, right where confidence is supposed to be.
The second idea is called geometric divergence. This basically describes the ever-widening gap between promises made on paper, like $38 trillion in debt, and what the actual real-world economy can support. The argument from the source is that these two things are drifting so far apart that the whole system is becoming unstable.
So when you pull all these sources together, the key takeaway is that these combined pressures are being seen as a kind of self-inflicted wound, one that's speeding up a global shift away from depending on any single currency.
And this slide really lays out the chain reaction that the materials describe. It's a three-step process. First, these simultaneous shocks chip away at global trust. Then, in response, countries start to divest, to sell off their U.S. debt. And finally, that pushes everyone to actively build and prepare for a multipolar world, one where alternatives to the dollar are going to play a much bigger role.
And honestly, this quote from the Standard just sums up the ultimate conclusion from the source material perfectly. The argument isn't that this shift wasn't going to happen anyway, but that current U.S. policies are basically acting like pouring gasoline on a fire. And all of this leaves us with one final, absolutely critical question. For decades, whenever there was a crisis, the U.S. dollar and its treasury bonds were seen as the world's ultimate safe haven. But if that perception starts to crack, if the foundation itself is seen as unstable, it really begs the question, where does all that global capital go next?